I'm delighted to say that the Times and Sunday Times Washington editor Katy has woken to join me to chat about the latest political lines out of Washington, D.C. Katy, good morning to you, and let's dive in to this latest news. Leaked papers which suggest even more strongly than we had heard before of Trump's derisive attitude towards the EU and his aim to kind of split off a number of countries who might be valuable allies in the future. Is this causing any unrest over there?
Yes.
Hello, Katy. Right, sorry.
Yes. I think obviously with the national security strategy released last week, you have a situation whereby it feels as though, the US is moving away from Europe. There's a question of whether you put the UK in that, or the UK is seen as different because of Brexit. But certainly, I think there is a hardening when it comes to the view of Europe and the UK, and a feeling that people in the administration will cite things like mass migration and say that they want to make Europe great again. They want to make Britain great again. Of course, how they see going about that isn't how many of the current European leaders do. But they do look at things like Brexit. They look at the rise of reform and think that moving these parties in a certain direction is how to do it.
One of the interesting things was the countries which, because we've heard Trump before and members of his administration talking about Europe committing civilizational suicide as a consequence of immigration. What Trump and his people seem to have done is to have identified 4 countries which buck the trend within the EU and who could be useful to the American administration in the future, and that's Austria, Italy, Hungary and Poland. I have to say I agree with them because I rather like those countries. But what were the reasons, do you think, for choosing those 4 countries?
Well, I think you look at where the populist right in Europe is on the rise, where they're making inroads, and then you start to see where the administration thinks there are countries that are going to move more towards them, and I think a lot of this is about finding countries or governments that are politically aligned with the Trump administration. And therefore, we know, for example, when you had Viktor Orban, Hungary, visiting the White House, a lot of praise for Hungary. When you think about, I think some, what the Trump administration want, they effectively would like to have, both in Europe and, for example, in the Americas and Central America and Latin America, to have leaders who support similar policies to the Trump administration. And those are policies which will be taking a tough line on immigration. They want to have parties of the right, particularly the populist right, in charge. And they would argue that makes these countries safer because it means you're going to have fewer immigrants there. And therefore, when they talk about civilizational decline, their point is, what are the percentage of your population going to look like? Now, of course, if you think about countries, how previous White Houses have acted, this is far more interventionist, particularly for a government that says it is America first. It's far more interventionist in the foreign affairs of other countries and much more political as a slant. But I think that is how we get to. They say there is almost a moral mission because these Western countries where they're meant to have shared values aren't going to have those if they keep on the route they're on.
No, indeed. I ought to apologise to listeners as well. There's a very long delay on the line from Washington. It's presumably the Washington Safeguarding Committee making sure that Katy doesn't say anything which could get her into any form of trouble. And so we will move on very quickly to Democrats releasing 19 more photographs from Jeffrey Epstein's estate, featuring President Trump, Steve Bannon, Bill Clinton and Richard Branson. The photographs do not, of course, imply any wrongdoing by those featured, but they will have gone down, they will have interested people, will they not?
No, and of course, this is all building up to next week when we have the deadline for the Epstein files. Ever since Congress voted to And that's when Donald Trump U-turned. It was only when we had a situation where he had enough rebels in his party forcing his hand. But the deadline now is for the Department of Justice to release all the files, and that comes next Friday. And the committee is releasing bits and bobs, I think, to keep the pressure up, sometimes from Democrats, sometimes from Republicans on the committee, sometimes from both. And this is the latest tranche, but I think some quite disturbing photos coming out, but really this is all building up to a big crescendo next week, when the files may still be redacted in part, but this is when I think, the real, I suppose, point where we see how much trouble various figures associated with the files are in.
Right. And Venezuela, I'm fascinated by Donald Trump's obsession with Venezuela, and he's targeting more and more sanctioned tankers for seizure off the coast of Venezuela. We've talked about this before, Katy. We've kind of ruled out any sort of boots on the ground intervention in Venezuela, at least temporarily. But what next do we think is going to be the development between America and Venezuela?
So the rhetoric is once again dialing up on this, and you have Trump talking about potential land strikes. So it could be that we're moving to, even more direct action on Venezuela, with the administration talking about cartels as their justification for doing it. We know that they are trying to pressurize Maduro to voluntarily leave. To effectively have regime change in a way where they don't actually have to have a full-blown, land invasion. But as ever with Trump, I think there's a lot of, does the rhetoric match the action they're planning, or is he trying to keep everyone guessing to force his way? But we know where the Make America Great Again movement has often in the past, not liked wars, forever wars. This one is seen as quite different. You have Marco Rubio on the one hand, who feels very strongly about it, the son of Cuban immigrants who grew up in Florida, where lots of, figures escaped from Venezuela, from these communist regimes. And then you also have J.D. Vance, who's also in support of a lot of this, because he sees it as a way of stopping the drugs crisis in America, which is an America First approach, whereas he's normally an isolationist on these issues. So there's more support for this than most foreign interventions.
And how does the MAGA base get on with President Trump's apparent inclination to relax restrictions on marijuana? They're not going to be lighting up their spliffs anytime soon, are they?
No, and I think this is an interesting one as to how far does Trump go on this. But as you say, if he does go and further delegalize, that is going to rub up against parts of the base who will question the wisdom of doing this at a time when I do think in the past couple of weeks there is a real feeling that the mood is turning when it comes to Donald Trump and his presidency, and you have a situation whereby I think, ever since you had Mandani winning in New York, you had governors winning in Virginia and New Jersey. You had this week the Democrats winning a mayoral in Miami. I think there is growing concern amongst the base that the administration is losing contact with its core voters, and therefore anything which they think further adds to that is going to make people very jumpy.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. That's Katy Balls. Katy, thanks ever so much for joining us. Apologies to listeners for the delay on the line there. But you can read Katy with no delay at all. Well, a delay until tomorrow morning, I suppose, in the Sunday Times tomorrow, or at any time with a digital subscription via thetimes.com.